The question is on the motion. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also-Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt-Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Brett, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Asa, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters,
You know, we go away for a weekend and Katie Britt just raises hell. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Well, it was her birthday. It was her birthday. She was having a rager.
Mr. Reed,
I had a rager for my birthday.
Mr. Ricketts,
She had a rager. It was her birthday.
Mr. Rish,
Rager.
Oh, Rager.
It was my birthday.
Ms. Rosen,
Peter, it was my birthday.
Mr. Rounds,
Exactly.
She's wearing orange today to warn you to stay away from the rager that is still continuing.
Basically,
Yes.
Mr. Sanders,
Do not come near
Mr.
rager in
Schatz.
progress.
It's gotta be a Crimson Tide kind
Mr. Shipp,
it's like a little bit too War Eagle for probably a lot of people that I represent.
Mr. Schmidt,
of this.
Mr. Schumer,
I went skiing. I went cross-country skiing
Oh,
for
fun.
about 2 hours with my law partner.
That's great.
Mr. Scott of Florida,
From him, because I didn't think I did a very good job of Robert Kennedy questions.
Mr. Scott of South Carolina,
What did I do wrong and why?
Oh, no, you're a ruminator.
I'm not really. That's,
Mrs. Shaheen,
Okay.
so it's like, I mean, you do the best.
Mr. Sheehy,
I thought it went okay for me with the tell.
Yeah, you did a good job. You did a really nice job. I didn't see you with the two of them.
Ms. Slotkin,
And you do a really nice job of asking very direct, challenging questions, but not in a way that's disrespectful, which is nice.
Ms. Smith,
I mean, because you still get in there and ask it, but you do it in a way that like preserves
Mr. Sullivan,
the statesman portion.
Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville,
It's a great point.
Mr. Van Hollen,
Because the goal is not to show off, the goal is to expose.
Or get the information that you asked.
Get the information.
Right? Like, who
Mr.
doesn't want
Warner,
answer to their questions?
Well, most of the time senators don't.
Well, no, I hear you.
Mr. Warnock,
Been standing versus, yeah.
Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden,
Yeah, he was being that.
Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cotton, Crapo, Grassley, Hoven, Husted, Langford, Lee, Moody, Mullen, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Tuberville. Senators voting in the negative: Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Coons, Durbin, Heinrich, Lujan, Merkley, Murphy, Schatz, Shaheen, Welch. Mr. Kelly? No. Mr. Thune? Aye. Mr. Paul? Aye. Ms. Rosen? No. Mr. Moreno? Mr. Moreno? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? No. Mr. Booker? Mr. Booker? No. Mr. Cornyn? Mr. Cornyn? Aye. Ms. Smith? Ms. Smith?
I did.
No. Mrs. Murray? Mrs. Murray? No. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders? No. Mr. McCormick? Mr. McCormick? Aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff? No. Ms. Ernst? Ms. Ernst? Aye. Ms. Slotkin? Ms. Slotkin? No. Ms. Cortez Masto? No. Ms. Warren? Ms. Warren? No. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Gallego? No. Mrs. Fisher? Mrs. Fisher? Aye. Mr. Kane? Mr. Kane? No. Mr. Warner? Mr. Warner? No. Mr. Van Hollen? Mr. Van Hollen? No. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott of Florida? Aye. Ms. Hassan? Ms. Hassan? No. Mr. Kim, no. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Justice, aye. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Curtis, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Wicker, aye.
Matt's still supposed to be.
Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mr. Wyden, Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Banks, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr.
Well,
Rono,
he's done so much action.
no. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Peters, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no.
So I saw you pick that. You would,
Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Hawley, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Ms. Also Brooks, no. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Warnock, no.
The yeas are 51, the nays are 46. The motion is agreed to. Clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Executive Office of the President, Russell Vaught of Virginia to be Director of the Office of Management and Budget.
Mr. President, I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Russell Vaught of Virginia to be Director of the Office of Management and Budget, signed by 17 senators as follows.
Mr. President, I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Is there an objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask that the Senate execute the order of January 30th in relation to the Wright nomination.
The clerk will report the Wright nomination.
Nomination, Department of Energy, Christopher Wright of Colorado to be Secretary.
Under the previous order, all post-cloture time is expired. The question occurs on the Wright nomination.
Ask consent this vote be 10 minutes.
Without objection. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt-Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Height-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody,
All right, and then I'll, see if any.
You got Peters over there.
This might mention the.
Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch,
You're good.
Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Curtis, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Gallego, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Husted, Johnson, Justice, Kennedy, King, Langford, Lee, Lujan, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Paul, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Tuberville, and Young. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye.
How you doing there, Timothy? Good to see you, sir. I'm just Jim.
Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Also Brooks, Blunt Rochester, Cantwell, Cortez Masto, Durbin, Gillibrand, Hirono, Kim, Markey, Murray, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Sanders, Schiff, Slotkin, Smith, Warnock, Welch, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff. No. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, no. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, no. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, no. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, no. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no.
All right.
The ayes are 59, the nays are 38. The nomination is confirmed.
Let's vote. The ayes are 59, the nays are 38. The nominee is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will immediately be notified of the Senate's action.
Mr. President,
Majority Whip.
I ask unanimous consent the mandatory quorum call with respect to the Bondi nomination be waived.
Is there objection? Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the nomination of Pamela Bondi of Florida to be Attorney General, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Pam Bondi of Florida to be Attorney General shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Baldwin. Thank you. Thank you. Blumenthal. Mr. Coons. Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett.
What on this side? Thanks, yes.
Gotcha.
Young guy.
Hey, he'll wait a second. I get you. I'll get him in a second. I'll get him in a second.
White House, no?
I think we need to figure out.